Hello, my friends, and I want to begin with Iran because the last 24 hours have been a textbook case of how perceptions of escalation can race ahead of facts until a single strategic variable changes the entire calculus. For most of yesterday, the accumulation of reporting suggested we were sliding toward some form of American military strike on Iran. Not a slow drift, but a rapid convergence of signals. Reports that the British were closing their embassy in Iran and evacuating personnel. Indications that other Western and European states were taking similar steps. Public messaging from the United States urging its citizens to leave Iran. And, interestingly, messaging of a similar kind from Russia as well, an indicator that something significant was being anticipated. Add to that a Reuters report, which I discussed previously, saying that Israeli officials and others believed the United States was on the brink of carrying out an attack. Meanwhile, Tehran itself appeared to be taking precautionary and preparatory steps. Iranian military officials issued unusually strong statements about retaliation and counteraction in the event of an American strike. There were reports that Iran had closed its airspace. There were also reports that the Iranian Air Force, such as it is, had launched aircraft and put them in the sky. Let me be clear about what that last point likely meant. It was not, in my view, intended to fight the far more capable U.S. and Israeli air forces head-to-head, nor to intercept a major strike package of cruise missiles, drones, and standoff munitions. It was more plausibly a survivability move, aircraft dispersal, and airborne preservation. In a first strike, runways, hangars, hardened shelters, and air bases themselves are among the highest priority targets. Getting aircraft away from the bases reduces the chance that the force is destroyed on the ground. So the pattern was consistent. The pieces looked like they were falling into place for a major clash. Then came a statement from the President of the United States saying he had received information from Iran that Iranian authorities were not moving forward with executions they were reportedly intending to carry out yesterday. He gave the impression that, for that reason, the United States would not conduct an immediate strike, though he conspicuously kept the option open. Over the next few hours, telltale signs of de-escalation began to accumulate. I emphasize, the crisis is far from over, but a pause, a short-term cooling, became visible. We also have to look at the military posture. There are reports that a U.S. Navy carrier strike group, led by the USS Abraham Lincoln, is being redeployed from the South China Sea toward the Persian Gulf region. That transit could take roughly a week to arrive on station, and once there, the group would require additional time to posture for major operations. In other words, if a strike is still in the plan, the timeline may point toward a window of a week to 10 days as additional assets move into place. At the same time, there are reports in U.S. media that Washington is considering options involving Tomahawk cruise missiles and long-range aircraft based in the continental United States. Strategic bombers of the type used in the strike on Iranian nuclear facilities during the June 12-day war, including B-2 bombers, and possibly older platforms such as Bone Second and even B-52 seconds. The pieces, then, still appear to be moving, yet the president's remarks signaled a near-term de-escalation, and in the last few hours the situation has quieted. Now we have a significant report from the Financial Times. Arab allies of the United States, Gulf states in particular, have been urgently advising the administration to call off the strike. Their reasons are direct and pragmatic. They fear a broader crisis that could destabilize oil markets. Above all, they do not want Iran to attempt closure of the Strait of Hormuz, something Iran apparently seriously considered during the June 12-day war. The consequences of closing Hormuz would be profound. Major disruption in oil flows, a sharp price rise, and critically, the blocking of exports for Arab oil producers whose shipments transit the Gulf and pass through Hormuz in huge volumes. A prolonged interruption would be devastating to their economies and, over the medium to long term, could threaten internal stability. That is why the Gulf states, whatever their other political and security concerns, are alarmed by proposals for an American strike. It is also noteworthy how positions have evolved. Saudi Arabia, not long ago among the loudest advocates of striking Iran, appears to have reconsidered. Now, we see increasingly explicit opposition to an escalation that could recoil onto Gulf economies. So, we have a moment of stabilization. The Financial Times piece contains another element that matters. An Arab official told the paper that hopes were growing that communication between Tehran and Washington exists, some of it possibly assisted by a third party such as Russia or Oman, and could develop into further talks in coming days. Observe the names placed together: Oman, the classic mediator, and Russia, a reference that aligns with what we have been seeing. This brings me to what I believe is the key variable in the last 24-48 hours: the shadow of Moscow now falling across Iran and the Gulf, and the possibility that Russia's entry, direct or indirect, has begun to alter strategic assumptions. In prior discussions, I argued that the single most important factor in the Iranian authorities' rapid success in quelling protests was the communications crackdown, the internet blackout, the cutting of mobile connectivity, and most importantly, the degradation and disruption of Starlink terminals in Iran. There continues to be debate about who supplied Iran with not only the technology but also the operational means to interfere with Starlink. Iran did not appear to have this capability during the June 2025 war. Russia and China do have that level of expertise. Either could provide the technical solution. But even if Iran has sophisticated technical talent, the speed with which this capability appears to have been deployed and used raises an operational question. Could the Iranian system absorb, integrate, and employ such sophisticated capability in such a short time? One analyst, Brian Berletic of the New Atlas, has emphasized that it can take a long time for a recipient country to fully absorb a sophisticated technology or weapon system and learn to use it effectively. That point pushes me toward a deduction without claiming certainty that there may be outside personnel on the ground assisting with operation and deployment, whether from Russia, China, or both. Now, from my experience, China possesses advanced capabilities, but tends to be restrained, sometimes extremely so, about putting its people in harm's way. I have also heard that Iran previously requested this kind of assistance from Russia, and that Russia had been reluctant, fearing the capability could fall into U.S. hands. If, however, Russian personnel are operating the systems themselves, that mitigates the concern, the technology stays controlled, the operational parameters remain in Russian hands, and the exposure risk changes. It also fits the pattern of Russian behavior historically, a greater willingness than China, up to now, to send personnel into dangerous environments when Moscow believes the strategic stakes justify it. To be clear, I do not know as a fact that it was Russia. It could be China. It could be both working in parallel. And if one is involved, the other almost certainly knows coordination and mutual awareness at that level is the normal expectation. Still, given Iran's geography, history, and security ties, Russia appears to me the more likely party to be physically present on the ground, if anyone is. And if that is true, it implies something else, a significant Iranian concession. Iran has long shown deep reluctance and unease about allowing outsiders inside its military and security systems. I remember the episode in 2015 when it became public that Russia was using Iranian airbases to support operations in Syria. The uproar in Iran was real, parliament protested, public controversy erupted, and the arrangement had to be cancelled, something that reportedly annoyed Moscow. The point is not to litigate that history, but to underline a cultural political reality. Iran's leadership has often resisted foreign operational footprints. So if Iran has now permitted outside personnel to help operate advanced systems such as those used to disrupt Starlink, that suggests Tehran judged the threat to regime stability to be extreme and imminent, perhaps a renewed regime change push akin to June 2025, and concluded it had no choice. At this point, I should incorporate the reporting and analysis of Alastair Crooke, former British diplomat with extensive Middle East experience, deep knowledge of Iran, the Arab world, and Israel, and close monitoring of Hebrew language Israeli media. Crooke has said publicly that after the Trump-Netanyahu meeting on 28 December, Israeli media, especially Hebrew language outlets, stated unequivocally that Trump gave Israel the green light to renew the operation, to complete the unfinished business of the June 2025 war, which is, in plain language, to pursue regime change in Tehran. And notice how this framing appears now in mainstream Western reporting. The Financial Times runs with the phrase unfinished business, even putting it in quotation marks. And the substance, when you read the reporting, is the toppling of the Tehran government. That is the implied endpoint. In that context, the Starlink disruption becomes not a technical footnote but a strategic shock. Washington and Tel Aviv appear to have assumed Starlink could not be seriously interfered with, yet it was. More information now suggests the result was not absolute shutdown, but severe degradation, intermittent connectivity, disrupted messaging, irregular transmission windows, enough to make sustained coordination across groups inside Iran extremely difficult. In addition, the technology may have been used to track terminals, leading to seizures, arrests, and publicized captures of equipment, something Iranian media has highlighted and which has also appeared in some Western reporting. This surprised many people. But the second-order effect matters even more. If Washington interprets Starlink disruption as a Russian commitment, an operational step taken to protect Iran from regime change mechanics, then it changes how the U.S. reads the whole theater. It would be seen as Moscow placing a marker. We are present, we are invested, and we have the means to affect your tools. That interpretation may help explain certain U.S. reactions that otherwise look impulsive or oddly timed. The abrupt announcement by President Trump of 25% tariffs on all countries maintaining dealings with Iran, the messaging about Americans being told to leave Russia, and reports of visa restrictions or reorganizations affecting Russian nationals. These look to me like angry, petulant reactions, classic Trump signaling rather than carefully sequenced strategic steps. They are the kind of moves a U.S. president makes when he feels his leverage has been challenged and wants to reassert dominance quickly, even at the cost of coherence. There are also circulating reports hard to verify that Russia warned Israel to back off from participating in an attack on Iran, with Russia allegedly offering in return to ensure that Iran and its proxies take no aggressive steps against Israel. This is precisely the kind of bargain Russia might attempt: de-escalate the Israeli front by offering restraint guarantees, while preventing the escalation into a U.S. Israeli strike campaign that could destabilize the region and threaten Russia's interests. Now, consider the mediation track. Oman, historically, is a reliable conduit. It would not surprise me at all if Oman is relaying messages now. But it would also not surprise me if there are back-channel contacts between Washington and Moscow specifically about Iran. Indeed, I suspect Russia has been advising Iran in ways that intersect directly with Trump's political needs. This brings us back to the execution issue. Trump's claim that Iran slowed down or paused moves toward executing protesters appears in substance correct. Iranian judicial authorities are now heatedly denying they plan to execute anyone on Wednesday, denying that certain named individuals reported in Western media as scheduled for execution were in that line. All I can say is that I follow Iranian media closely, and in the preceding rhetoric and signals, it did appear that the authorities were indeed preparing to move rapidly toward harsh measures, potentially including executions. And then, abruptly, the rhetoric changed. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, has said Iran has no plans to execute anyone. He spoke as if hanging is not on the table. Whether this is entirely sincere or a tactical retreat is the question. But the change is undeniable, abrupt, and significant. Here, I will state my speculation openly. I wonder whether Tehran received strong advice not to proceed with executions, and whether that advice came from Moscow. There are several reasons. First, executions would be morally wrong and strategically foolish. Second, they would inflame domestic tensions rather than calm them, potentially widening the protest base. Third, they would do massive damage to Iran's international reputation at a moment when Iran needs diplomatic space. Fourth, and crucially, they would remove Trump's political off-ramp. Trump has spoken of protecting Iranian protesters. If Iran began executing protesters, Trump could find himself under intense pressure, domestic and ally, to act, using humanitarian protection as a pretext. Halting executions removes that pretext and provides Trump a way to pause without looking weak. In other words, it grants him the excuse he needs: they stopped, so I stopped. That kind of off-ramp is pure political oxygen for him. So, I am not claiming briefings from Russians, Iranians, Americans, or Gulf states. I am reading the pattern. Statements, shifts, military movement, and the key technical factor, Starlink disruption. That factor points, in my judgment, toward Moscow's involvement in some form. There is a second clue, though it is a clue by absence, and such deductions must be handled carefully. So far, Russians and Iranians are conspicuously not publicizing contacts with each other. That is strange. Moscow has made forthright statements against any attack on Iran and against attempted regime change. It would be natural for Iranian leaders, President Pezeshkian or Foreign Minister Araghchi, to publicly contact their counterparts in Moscow, Putin and Lavrov, and to publicize it. We have not seen that. The lack of such messaging suggests to me not that contacts are absent, but that they are extensive and intentionally quiet. A complex diplomatic game is underway. It may serve everyone to keep certain channels concealed. Where does that leave us? For now, there is a pause. But it is only a pause. The unfinished business remains unfinished. Regime change remains the ultimate objective, and there are reports that Trump met with his national security team and told them he would only consider an attack if it guaranteed regime change. He does not want a long drawn-out war. He does not want boots on the ground. He wants a quick toppling operation that collapses the Iranian government, and he wants military action to guarantee that result. I will set aside, for the moment, the question of why Trump imagines regime change in Iran would benefit the United States. In my view, it would likely become a disaster. If the present government collapsed, Iran could plunge into prolonged internal crisis. Reuters has noted that the current government still has a substantial constituency. Iran's security forces are large and well-armed. If the regime fell, elements of those forces could retreat into mountainous areas and wage long-term resistance with their backs to the wall. The U.S. could end up with a crisis worse than anything we have seen, But assume Trump does not understand that and believes Iranians yearn for a monarchy restoration and a crown prince. The key point is, the objective is now regime change. We have moved very far from June, when the public justification was uranium enrichment. Now it is, straightforwardly, political toppling. Other stated reasons, ballistic missiles, regional proxies, are secondary. The strategic endpoint is replacing the current government with a pro-American, pro-Western regime and, as a bonus, dealing a blow to BRICS. Yet Trump does not want a long war. He remembers Iraq and the disaster. He probably has some awareness of Libya and Syria. In the back of his mind, whether he articulates it or not, is the legacy of Vietnam, how divisive it was, how politically corrosive, and how economically damaging. He does not want that. And so we are left with a dangerous instability. If Trump believes a strike can deliver regime change quickly, he may authorize it. If Iran stabilizes internally and strengthens security relationships with Russia and also with China, then the regime change threat may begin to recede, not because Washington becomes benevolent, but because the cost and uncertainty rise. This returns us to the Iranian currency collapse 2 or 3 weeks ago. I have said repeatedly that the collapse of the rial is partly the product of long-standing monetary, financial, and economic mismanagement, aggravated by policies under President Pezeshkian and his officials that were not properly designed or implemented. Crook, who knows Iran better than I do, has said much the same. I now also accept that the crash was likely artificially engineered. Crook described large-scale shorting of the rial in Dubai financial markets, precipitating the sudden collapse, and framed it as part of the renewed operation to topple the Iranian government, an operation discussed by Trump and Netanyahu in December. Crook added another point that is crucial. China has already signaled to Iran long ago that if Iran needs financial assistance to smooth the crisis, China is willing to step in. Funds can be moved rapidly through existing BRICS financial mechanisms and through direct Chinese intervention. The sums required are often much smaller than people assume. In an unpublished discussion I referenced previously, the figure of $1 billion was floated as a potential Chinese intervention size. My view is that would be more than enough. $100 and $200 million might have been sufficient if done correctly, because currency stabilization often turns on confidence, not just brute force liquidity. The mere fact of Chinese commitment can itself stabilize expectations. China, done properly, could even profit from such stabilization. This is basic. When a large actor credibly signals, the market moves. We would likely have seen the rial stabilize quickly, domestic mood improve, initial signs of inflation easing, and the first steps toward economic stabilization. All it might have taken was a direct request and a clear mechanism. But there is no sign this option was pursued. Instead, Iranian officials produced a catalog of statements blaming sanctions and insisting little could be done. That is a confidence killer. When you can do something, it makes no sense to publicly proclaim helplessness. Iran has spent 40 years trying to do everything alone. It is now in BRICS. It should exploit that. If it did, it would not only stabilize the domestic situation but also make external regime change operations far harder to execute. That is the strategic point. Economic stabilization plus security partnership reduces vulnerability to manipulation and coordinated unrest. So my sense is that Iran is in a moment of brief stabilization. What happens in the next weeks depends heavily on decisions in Tehran. Iran is not without friends. It needs to let those friends help, and it needs to listen on governance questions too, because internal criticisms exist and are not all foreign manufactured. If Iran addresses domestic grievances while strengthening external buffers, it may find a way through. If it fails, the next attack, likely within months, will be more powerful, more organized, and better prepared. That is the Iran picture. Now, Ukraine. The war continues, and the last 24 hours have produced further developments that fit the broader pattern. Russia advances on the ground while expanding the campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure and urban power systems. The blackout of Ukrainian cities is not episodic now. It is becoming routine. Kiev is in an open political row. President Zelensky is clashing with Kiev's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, over blackouts in city management. Zelensky's circle blames Klitschko for failures in Kiev's energy situation. Zelensky has declared a state of emergency around the energy system, and there is talk of importing additional gas, oil, and electricity from Europe. That may help on the margins but cannot change the overall trajectory if Russia continues systematic strikes on generation, distribution, and logistics. Meanwhile, Zelensky is also engaged in political maneuvering internally. I previously discussed how the anti-corruption scandal is being refocused against rivals, with European assistance likely. There was mention of investigative pressure on Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, there is another move reported in detail by the invaluable Substack, Events in Ukraine Tied to Reorganization Inside Ukraine's Security Apparatus. We have seen reshuffling at the top. Budanov shifted from military intelligence leadership to a chief of staff role. The dismissal of SBU head Maluk and replacement by someone aligned to Zelensky's old ally Andriy Yermak. And additional appointments that appear connected to internal security enforcement. The new figure described by Events in Ukraine is particularly telling. He reportedly has a background in Ukrainian law enforcement, but also allegations, indeed documented claims of deep involvement in organized crime networks, including a criminal conviction connected to that world. The descriptions portray a ruthless, brutal individual associated with deeply troubling activities. I choose my words carefully, but the implication is not subtle. This is not the profile of a conventional security professional chosen for institutional credibility. It resembles the kind of personnel choice governments make when they fear loss of control and want enforcers without inhibitions. History provides parallels. As World War II turned against Germany, the Germans reorganized internal security in occupied or satellite states and often recruited violent individuals with criminal backgrounds. There are examples in northern Italy after 1943 under the German-backed regime, and the more infamous French case of a violently repressive internal security organization that recruited criminals and extremists and later saw many return to criminality after the war. The strategic logic is ugly but consistent. When regimes feel they are losing grip, they turn to ruthless men who will do what normal officials will not. If this appointment is real and accurately described, it is indicative of the internal Ukrainian situation deteriorating and of preparations for increasingly coercive internal control as external military conditions worsen. In some respects, it may be even more revealing than Budanov's repositioning to the chief of staff role, which I have argued looks like groundwork for an insurgency framework once conventional lines break.